They called it the death seat. Inside the Sherman tank, a machine meant to protect its crew from fire, steel, and shrapnel, there existed one position that inspired more fear than German 88s, more dread than Panther ambushes, and more whispered rumors than any other spot in the armored forces. Every Sherman crewman, from rookie replacements to veterans who had burned out 3 tanks already, knew exactly which seat it was, and they prayed they would never be ordered to sit there. For outsiders, the interior of a Sherman looked cramped, chaotic, and indistinguishable. But for the men living inside this steel world, every inch carried meaning. The gunner fought the battle. The commander saw the battlefield. The driver controlled the life of the entire vehicle. The loader kept the cannon breathing. Yet one position, the assistant driver, or bow gunner, was universally understood to be the most dangerous place a man could occupy. It was the point where German shells struck first, where armor was thinnest, where escape routes were worst, and where the likelihood of surviving a penetration dropped close to zero. To understand why, you must picture the Sherman not from the outside, where its rounded turret and confident silhouette suggested reliability, but from the inside, where the hull front formed a coffin-like wedge, pointed directly at German guns. The assistant driver sat there, knees pressed under the hull machine gun, chest against the front plate, feet by ammunition racks. The armor protecting him was only 50 millimeters thick, sloped poorly in early models, and precisely at the height where German anti-tank gunners were trained to aim. In battle reports, this area was the most frequently recorded entry point for enemy shells. German gunners knew this weakness well. Their manuals instructed crews to fire at the lower front hull, the exact spot where the Sherman's death seat occupant sat. The reason was simple. Penetrating the bow often meant hitting sponson ammunition racks located just behind him. For much of the war, those racks held dry-stored 75mm shells, powder bags that ignited like gasoline when exposed to flame or hot metal. Once ignited, the result was catastrophic. Survivors described it as an instant flash fire, faster than a man could scream, filling the turret and killing everyone before the tank even stopped moving. Sherman crews had a dark joke. If the bow gunner gets hit, the rest of us get a funeral. Because the assistant driver was so exposed, he also had the lowest chance of escaping a burning tank. The turret crew had 3 hatches within reach. The driver had his own. The commander had 2 ways out. But the bow gunner? His hatch opened forward, toward the direction of enemy fire. If the hull was hit, the hatch warped shut. If the tank burned, smoke and flame rose directly beneath his position. Many never made it out. Veterans remembered this fear. In letters home, young crewmen wrote that they hoped for any role except the bow gunner. Some commanders quietly assigned their strongest or most experienced man to that seat, believing he had the highest chance of staying calm under pressure. Others did the opposite, placing inexperienced replacements there because veteran crews would flatly refuse to move from their safer turret positions. The reputation of the death seat grew with every battle. At Kasserine Pass, at Normandy, at the Hürtgen Forest, at the Rhine, tank battalions documented that the assistant driver position suffered the highest fatality rate in the Sherman's 5-man crew. Yet the fear wasn't just about armor thickness or escape routes. What made the position truly terrifying was its proximity to the vehicle's most volatile element, its ammunition. Before the adoption of wet stowage in late 1944, the Sherman's side racks practically guaranteed an internal explosion if the hull was penetrated. German anti-tank weapons, especially the Pak-40 and the dreaded 88, could punch through the bow plate effortlessly. The blast fragments and superheated metal then traveled straight into the racks beneath the bow gunner's legs. The ignition of even a single shell often led to the tank becoming a brew-up, the British term for a vehicle cooking off into a column of flame visible for miles.
One tanker described it this way: when the bow gets hit, you don't die from the impact. You die from everything that happens after. Still, the assistant driver was not merely a passive target. He operated the hull machine gun, managed the left side periscope, handled map reading, checked the transmission, and assisted the driver with gear shifting on rough inclines. He was vital to the Sherman's operation, especially in urban fighting where front-facing firepower made the difference between survival and and ambush. Many bow gunners fought bravely, firing until the tank itself could no longer function. But even the bravest admitted quietly that they feared their seat more than their enemy. As the war progressed, the WWII Army recognized the problem. Newer Shermans added wet stowage, improved hull slopes, better escape designs, and flame-suppressing interiors. These upgrades helped, but the reputation of the death seat never faded. Even with improvements, the bow gunner remained the man closest to danger. The first in line when German armor appeared, and the last to escape when things went wrong. Every Sherman crew shared the same understanding. The tank might burn, the turret might be trapped, the enemy might be anywhere. But if you sat in that front right seat, your war would be shorter than the others, and you knew it. The fear of the bow gunner's seat did not come from superstition or rumor alone. It came from the cold, mathematical reality of combat. After-action reports collected throughout 1943 and 1944 showed that the majority of hits on a Sherman landed on the forward hull plate, and especially on the right side exactly where the assistant driver sat. German gunners trained with silhouettes that marked the Sherman's weak points, and the bow was highlighted as the most effective target. When a PaK-40 or an A-88 opened fire, it aimed low and to the right, striking the place least likely to deflect a shot and most likely to kill instantly. Veterans remembered the way shells sounded when they hit the bow. The impact came with a brutal metallic crack followed by a deep echo that rolled through the tank, like thunder trapped inside a steel drum. A man sitting in the bow gunner's seat didn't just hear the hit, he felt it in his ribs and teeth. Even non-penetrating shots were enough to rattle the nerves of the calmest soldier. Penetrations were something else entirely. Survivors described a blinding flash, a wave of scorching air, and an eruption of sparks and splinters that turned the hull interior into a furnace of metal and smoke. One tanker wrote, "When the bow gets punched through, it's not one man who dies. It's the whole crew choking on flame before they can move." The assistant driver's hatch was another cruel irony. On paper, it provided a direct escape forward. In reality, if the tank was hit, the hatch often jammed instantly from deformation. Both gunners described clawing at the locking mechanism, with their gloves melting against the hot steel. If the tank pitched forward, slid into a ditch, or stopped at an angle, the hatch became physically impossible to open. Many were found still strapped into their seats after a tank had burned out completely. Then there was the issue of ammunition. Before wet stowage was introduced, the Sherman carried dozens of rounds stored directly beneath the bow gunner's legs. In Normandy, tank battalions recorded that more than half of all catastrophic brew-ups were triggered by hits that passed through the bow gunner position into the side racks. These racks contained propellant charges that ignited faster than a man could react. If just one round cooked off, it ignited the rest in a chain reaction that destroyed the tank from within. A German officer captured during the Battle of the Bulge later remarked, "Against the Sherman, shoot low. If you hit the bow, you kill 5 men instead of 1. This was the brutal logic of tank combat. Inside the Sherman, the assistant driver had responsibilities beyond simply sitting in a dangerous seat. He served as the tank's secondary set of eyes. He monitored terrain for obstacles or mines, operated the hull machine gun, and managed radio messages if the commander was overwhelmed. In chaotic battles, urban fights, wooded terrain, or night operations, he was the man who caught what others missed. Yet all these duties were overshadowed by the knowledge that he occupied the highest mortality position inside the tank. Tank commanders sometimes admitted quietly that they avoided assigning certain men to that seat. If a crew had formed a close bond, they shielded their youngest or most inexperienced member by placing him as a loader, rather than a bow gunner. But not every crew had this luxury. Replacement soldiers arriving in batches were frequently assigned to the front right seat, simply because it was open. Many of these replacements lasted only a few days before their tank was hit. One replacement wrote in his diary, "They put me in the assistant driver's hole. The boys call it the coffin. I try not to think about it." As the war intensified, especially in Normandy and the Hürtgen Forest, the bow gunner's dread became part of the Sherman's culture. Crews joked about it darkly, but the fear was real. When a tank prepared for battle, the assistant driver climbed into his seat last, often hesitating for a moment before closing the hatch. That simple action, pulling the steel lid shut above him, felt like sealing the entrance to into a tomb. The psychological burden grew heavier as stories spread. One battalion near Saint-El recorded 19 bow gunner fatalities in a single week. Another unit fighting near Aachen reported that in every tank destroyed by frontal fire, the assistant driver was the first to die or became trapped beyond rescue. Infantrymen supporting armor knew the danger too. When a Sherman brewed up, they often saw only one or two crewmen escape even though the turret crew technically had the fastest exits. Heat, smoke, and shrapnel turned split-second decisions into life-or-death struggles. The man in the bow rarely had that split second, yet despite the danger, thousands of men took that seat anyway. They climbed in because the tank needed them, because their crew needed them, because someone had to do the job, and because war left no room for negotiation. Bow gunners developed their own survival tricks. Some placed sandbags around the interior edges of their compartment to absorb fragments, not that it helped against an 88mm round. Others tied small tools or knives near their hatch to help pry it open if it jammed. Some wore extra scarves around their necks to reduce burns from flash fires. A few even stuffed extra rations under the seat because the bow was colder in winter and hotter in summer than the turret. These small rituals gave them a sense of control in a place where nearly everything was uncontrollable. The introduction of wet stowage reduced internal fire casualties dramatically. Sherman variants equipped with the new system recorded up to 75% fewer crew fatalities after penetrations. But even with wet racks, the bow remained the first target for German gunners. The slope improved, but the thickness did not. The hatch remained awkward, the confined space remained a trap, and the fear remained too. Many veterans later admitted that they still dreamed about that seat decades after the war. One former bow gunner said, "Everyone else in the tank sits behind armor. We sat in front of it." That simple distinction defined the experience. The assistant driver was the shield, the first line of steel between the enemy and the crew behind him. In a way, he was the tank's human armor, absorbing the danger meant for the others. Crewmen respected that sacrifice deeply. When they lost a bow gunner, it hit the crew harder than the loss of anyone else. In armored divisions, it became common for commanders to offer bow gunners transfers after they survived multiple engagements. Some moved willingly to safer roles. Others refused. Those who refused said the same thing. "If I leave, someone else takes my place. I'll stay." These men who accepted the tank's most dangerous seat day after day became legends within their battalions. They were not the ones firing the main gun or commanding the tank, but they were the ones who faced the highest risk with the least recognition. Their courage defined the Sherman as much as its gun, its tracks, or its silhouette. Without them, without the men who sat willingly in the seat everyone feared, the tank could not fight at all. And that is why the assistant driver's place was not just the deadliest seat inside the Sherman, it was also one of the bravest. The deeper crews went into Europe, the worse the fighting became, and the deadliest seat inside the Sherman grew even more notorious. Terrain changed, enemy weapons changed, and the German army, fighting with increasing desperation, threw its most lethal anti-tank guns into every village, every hedgerow, every crossroads. The bow gunner, sitting inches behind the thinnest plate of armor on the tank, now faced threats from every direction. Veteran tank commanders noticed that their bow gunners began to move differently, quieter, slower, with the kind of controlled focus that comes only from living face-to-face with danger. In the Normandy hedgerows, where visibility was reduced to a few dozen meters, German infantry armed with Panzerfausts waited behind earthen walls. The shape of the Sherman's bow made it the easiest point to hit as the tank emerged through a gap. Panzerfaust projectiles didn't just penetrate, they ripped through the front plate and tore the interior apart with superheated jet blast. Bow gunners were often the first victims. Some died instantly, others survived the blast but suffered burns so severe that medics had to cut them out of the seat. One infantry lieutenant recalled watching a Sherman push through a hedgerow, only to be struck in the bow before it could fully clear the gap. When it hit, he wrote, the hull lit up orange like a furnace. The turret crew climbed out burnt but alive. The bow gunner never moved. Experiences like this spread throughout units. Bow gunners heard every story. They collected them, analyzed them, and tried to understand why one man lived while another died. Many concluded that survival was simply a lottery, right time, right angle, right miracle. As the fighting shifted into towns places like Saint-Brest, Aachen the Sherman became even more vulnerable. Urban streets turned into kill zones. German anti-tank teams lurked in upper windows or basements, firing downward or upward into the Sherman's frontal arc. A downward angle meant the projectile struck near the bow gunner's feet. An upward angle meant it struck directly into his chest. Tank destroyer crews sometimes joked darkly that Sherman bow gunners don't growl, but there was truth in the grim humor. Inside the tank, the assistant driver had no illusions. He felt every vibration through the hull plate. He heard the distant thump of an A-88 being fired. He could tell from the echo whether the shell was coming close. He learned to recognize, almost instinctively, the sound of a ricochet, a near miss, a glancing blow, and the sickening metallic crunch of a penetrating hit. Sherman crews developed their own ways to support their bow gunners psychologically. Some commanders checked on them before every battle, asking quietly, "You good?" The answer was always yes, even when it wasn't. Crews understood that hesitation from one man created doubt in all five. So the bow gunner, sitting in the most dangerous seat, pretended to feel brave not for himself, but for everyone else. One veteran said, "You couldn't show fear. If you did, the whole crew felt it. And if the whole crew felt it, the tank died." This emotional burden was unique to the assistant driver. The commander stood half exposed, but he could see danger. The gunner controlled the main gun. The loader had constant physical work to distract him. The driver, though in front, had the engine and steering levers to focus on. The bow gunner, however, sat low, isolated, with nothing but a machine gun and a periscope and time to think. He was the only crewman whose job required him to stare directly at the path of incoming fire. He saw the enemy before anyone else did. He saw the flashes of guns, the shapes of ambush sites, the smoke trails of Panzerfausts. He saw where the shot would land, sometimes a second before it hit. In those moments, the fear was unlike anything else in war. Gunners spoke of feeling their hands go cold despite the heat. Some whispered the same quiet prayer every time the tank moved into a suspected ambush zone. A few replaced the pads inside their helmets because they wore through them, from pressing their heads so tightly against the periscope guards. When the WWII Army introduced the later M4A3 variants with improved armor profiles, the situation improved slightly but not enough to erase the reputation of the bow gunner's compartment. Even upgraded armor struggled against late-war German weapons like the Pak-43 or the high-velocity Panzerfaust 60. A hit anywhere on the lower glacis almost always resulted in casualties in the front seats. Statistics collected after the war revealed a striking pattern. The assistant driver accounted for a disproportionate share of crew fatalities, more than any other position except, in some cases, the loader. German reports noted the same observation, describing the Sherman's bow as its most vulnerable feature, and advising gunners to target it specifically. Even when the Sherman survived a hit, the bow gunner's position amplified shock and concussion. A non-penetrating round could crack ribs or knock a man unconscious. Several survivors described being deaf for days after a glancing strike. Others recalled coughing blood from internal bruising caused by the violent force transferring through the armor plate. One bow gunner hit by a glancing 75mm round during the Battle of the Bulge later wrote, "It felt like a giant mule kicked me through the hull. I woke up looking at the ceiling, not sure if I was alive." But for many crews, the seat did not represent death, it represented duty. Someone had to be there when the tank rolled forward. Someone had to fire the hull machine gun, spot mines, warn the driver of ditches and obstacles, and watch for enemy infantry trying to approach with explosives. In close assaults, the bow gunner was the first defense against enemy soldiers with grenades or satchel charges. This made the position deadly but essential, and that sense of purpose became its own form of courage. By late 1944, experienced crews had mixed feelings when they received replacements. They wanted to protect new men from the deadliest seat, but they also needed someone willing to take it. Many replacements were told bluntly, "You're in the hot seat. Learn fast." Units that saw heavy fighting developed a kind of rotating system, where the assistant driver role was shared. But during active combat, rotation was nearly impossible. A crew that had practiced together knew each other's rhythms. Moving someone out of the bow seat before a mission could disrupt that invisible sink something tankers depended on for survival. So the bow gunners stayed where they were, day after day, road after road, town after town. They shut the hatch, tightened the straps of their helmet, leaned into the periscope, and hoped they would see danger before it saw them. As the war drew toward its end, many bow gunners described a strange shift in their mindset. Fear became routine. Danger became normal. They no longer flinched at distant gunfire. They stopped reacting to each hit against the hull. They grew accustomed to the heat, the noise, the vibration, and the constant knowledge that the next shell might end their life before they even understood what had happened. But they never forgot the responsibility that came with the seat. The assistant driver's place was the least glamorous, the most dangerous, and the most emotionally taxing position in the Sherman. Yet it belonged to men who carried that burden willingly. When peace finally came and crews abandoned their tanks for the last time, many veterans later said that stepping out of the bow gunner's compartment felt like stepping out of a grave. But they also said something else. It was the worst seat in the tank, but I'm proud that it was mine. As the war entered its final brutal phase in early 1945, the Sherman's bow gunner faced the deadliest conditions yet. Germany was collapsing, but a wounded animal is most dangerous, and the Wehrmacht fought with a ferocity fueled by desperation. Town after town was transformed into a fortress. Every cellar window hid a Panzerfaust. Every street corner concealed an anti-tank gun dragged there by half-starved soldiers, or Hitler youth who had never held a weapon before. For the bow gunner, this meant that every movement of the tank, every turn of the street, every inch the Sherman advanced could be the last. Crews learned quickly that attacking a German-held town meant rolling directly toward layered kill zones. At the front of the formation, Shermans were hit first, and the bow gunner, sitting in the lowest and most forward position, absorbed the full consequence of each decision. Veterans later admitted that 1945 was the year when bow gunners aged a decade in months. In the city of Cologne, tank crews reported seeing entire buildings collapse from explosives used by German defenders to funnel American armor into narrow streets. When the first Sherman in a column was struck, the entire street filled instantly with dust and concrete, trapping the following tanks with no room to maneuver. In these moments, bow gunners had one of the hardest tasks imaginable, trying to spot ambushers through a haze so thick that even silhouettes were impossible to distinguish. One tank commander described it. The man in the bow was blind except for a small slit of daylight, and that slit always seemed to be aimed exactly where the enemy hid. The Panzerfaust 100 introduced that year made the job even worse. With a higher effective range and larger warhead, it could punch through the Sherman's lower glacis almost effortlessly. The assistant driver knew that his seat was directly in the line of fire. Many did not survive these city battles, yet replacements continued to arrive, and the seat continued to be filled because every Sherman needed that pair of eyes, that machine gun, that second driver's set of hands for emergencies. Sherman crews often said that by 1945, the tank ate bow gunners. It wasn't cruelty, it was bitter honesty forged from months of watching friends die. But alongside the despair was a fierce loyalty that defined American armor crews. No one faced the bow unless he chose to, and yet nearly every man who was asked stepped forward. One reason the position remained essential was the increasing use of close-quarters German infantry tactics. Small squads with magnetic mines, bundled grenades, or Panzerfausts attempted to run right up to American armor. The bow gunner's 30 caliber machine gun was the first, and sometimes only, defense against these suicide charges. Many crews survived solely because the assistant driver reacted a split second faster than the Germans expected. There are recorded instances where bow gunners fired continuously through flames, through choking smoke, through smashed periscope glass, because they knew that if they paused even for a moment, a German soldier might close the last 10 meters and destroy the tank. In these deadly seconds, the bow gunner became the thin line between survival and annihilation. Even the Sherman's improved variants, the M4A3A DZ8 with better suspension and stronger front armor, could not eliminate the danger. The glacis was sloped, yes. But the assistant driver's position remained the most vulnerable point on the hull. The front plate still lacked the thickness to reliably deflect late-war anti-tank weaponry. Bow gunners were painfully aware of this. They sat in the tank knowing their armor was good but not good enough. In the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, snow-covered forests hid German anti-tank teams equipped with the fearsome Pak-40. The 75mm rounds from that gun could penetrate the Sherman at over 1,000 meters. Many tanks were lost before crews ever spotted the threat. Survivors often testified that the first thing to disappear after a hit was the bow gunner's position. A tank commander from the 3rd Armored Division remembered approaching a ridgeline when an 88mm gun opened fire. The front of the tank vanished inward. Smoke filled the hull. The driver shouted for the bow gunner. He never answered. Stories like this filled letters, home unit journals, and after-action reports. Officers noted the psychological toll on bow gunners. Some showed signs of severe stress, trembling hands, 1,000-yard stares, sudden bursts of silence or nervous laughter. But because the war required constant movement, there was no time for treatment. Men coped in silence, driving forward into more danger. In the final push across the Rhine, the pace intensified. American armor spearheaded the advance. Bow gunners spent hours at a time staring through their tiny viewing ports, scanning for muzzle flashes, disturbed earth, or suspicious shadows. They slept in their seats, ate in their seats, waited in their seats, never far from the realization that the next street might be their last. One veteran wrote, "You didn't fear the battle anymore. You feared the moments between battles when your mind had time to think." When Germany finally surrendered, bow gunners emerged from their tanks like men waking from a long nightmare. Many said their ears rang for months afterward. Some carried scars. Others carried memories too painful to share. The seed that had terrified them also became part of their identity, a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and quiet heroism. After the war, military analysts studied Sherman casualties and confirmed what crews had long suspected. The bow gunner's station accounted for one of the highest fatality rates among all armored crew positions in the U.S. Army. This was not because the men were less protected, it was because they were positioned directly in the kill zone of the most common German firing angles. Historically, armies remember commanders, gunners, and aces, but the assistant drivers of Sherman tanks did work that rarely made headlines. They saved entire crews by spotting threats unseen by others. They fired until weapons overheated, guided tanks out of ambushes, kept calm when the hull was shaking, and accepted a role where bravery was measured not in glory, but in endurance. In reunions decades later, surviving tank crews often placed special respect on the men who once sat in the bow seat. They knew better than anyone else the invisible weight those soldiers carried. Many said openly that the bow gunners were the bravest among them, not because they charged enemy positions or destroyed tanks, but because they faced fear every single minute inside the hull and still did their duty. The bow gunner's compartment was the smallest, hottest, darkest, and most vulnerable space inside the Sherman, yet the men who sat there were some of the most steadfast soldiers of the war. Their courage was quiet and celebrated, and often unrecognized by the public. But among tankers, among the men who lived through fire and steel, no position commanded more respect. And that is why, when historians speak of the Sherman's weaknesses, veterans often correct them gently. The armor wasn't the real story. The real story was the men who sat behind it. Their legacy endures not in monuments or medals, but in the understanding that courage is not always loud. Sometimes, courage sits in a cramped steel compartment, staring into the unknown, knowing very well what might come and doing its job anyway.